segue. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon and happy Sabbath, everyone. On behalf of Religious Liberty Ministries, I just want to welcome you guys to the afternoon session. I'm hoping that after some lunch and the worship hour, you're feeling both physically and spiritually fed. I'm encouraged to see some faces here for this afternoon session where we'll gain some more spiritual blessings, I'm sure. I also want to just personally and publicly thank Jonathan and his family for coming up this weekend. It's a long trek for the family, 7 hours or so, is that right? Yeah. So it's a long haul, but we're so grateful that they came here to share their family with us and for Jonathan to share his ministry with us. Last time I saw Jonathan was 3 or 4 months ago. We were in Canada skiing together, and in between him tumbling down the mountain, he would find people to talk to and share glow tracts and other spiritual literature with those around him. And I guess I say all that to say that Jonathan has lived a life both in word and in action in service to God, and I respect him, and I'm just grateful for you being here. So I'll turn it over to him now, but let's go ahead and say a word of prayer before we do that. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this Sabbath day, for bringing us together to worship you. May this time together bring you honor and bring you glory. Be with Jonathan. Bless the words that he's about to give us this afternoon. Thank you for the morning message where we learned about true revival. Help us to be vigilant and help that vigilance to be grounded in your word. And I pray for each member here, each person represented. Bless them and bless Jonathan and his family as he goes out into the world. Bless his ministry, bless his family. We love you and thank you, Lord. Amen. Jonathan joins us. The girls have a special music presentation. Go ahead, girls.
Look for Hello, hello, there we go. That's better, thank you. All right, we're going to do a little religious liberty update this afternoon and talk about some different cases and things happening and their prophetic significance. And before we get started, let's have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you for the Sabbath, Lord. Thank you for revealing things to us in your word and through your prophets, Lord, so that we might be aware and that when we see them, Lord, that we may believe and believe even more. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'm going to tell you a trick. If you're ever skiing, if you tumble on purpose, people like to come and help you, and then it's a great way, by the way, here's a glow track. So all those falls were on purpose, Robert. You just didn't know that. No, we actually met, there happened to be the Invictus Games, which is some Paralympic thing that was happening there, and got to meet some athletes and talk to them. A couple of them skied with us. That was fun, and got to share with them some literature and all, so hopefully they read it and touched their hearts. All right. See if this clicker... Do I have the wrong clicker? Oh, there we go. Okay, so as was mentioned earlier, I'm the director of American Christian Ministries. Used to be American Cassette Ministries. We have over 8,000 sermons on our app, going back to the early 70s. Different Adventist preachers and speakers. It was my wife's grandpa, Al Newhart, that started the ministry in Pennsylvania. No one was recording our sermons at camp meetings and all, so he took his reel-to-reel thing and started duplicating them, and then it went to cassettes and then CDs, and we digitized all those sermons and put them on an app so you can go and listen to them. So if you don't have our app, I encourage you to do that. All right. So a couple of years ago, I got to go to the United States Supreme Court, and one of my cases, Gerald Groff, he was a postal driver, rural route driver in Pennsylvania, and he, didn't have a problem most of his career working for the post office because they didn't deliver mail on Sundays. But then, Amazon came along and they worked out a deal with the post office to have them deliver Amazon packages on Sundays. And so he was at a bigger location, and he changed. Thank you. He changed to a more rural location that didn't do Amazon packages, but eventually Amazon went everywhere, and so they started requiring the postal drivers, the route carriers, to deliver packages on Sundays there. And he was disciplined and filed suit. And what the law had said at the time is that an employer has to accommodate an employee's religious observance unless it'd be an undue hardship on the business. And the Supreme Court had defined the term undue hardship back in the 1970s in a case, Hardison versus TWA Airlines, had defined undue hardship as anything more than a de minimis cost or expense. Now, the word de minimis means trivial or nothing. So basically, a employer could get out of accommodating a Seventh-day Adventist or Muslim or whoever if it would be anything beyond a trivial burden on the employer. And so there really wasn't a whole lot of teeth to the law, and it made it difficult for employees like Adventists to get accommodated in the workplace, unless there was some sort of state law that had more teeth to it. And so we've been trying to change that, and that's been the law since the early 70s. And we've been trying to bring a case before the Supreme Court to change that, to make it harder on employers to not accommodate. And so finally, after rejecting an Adventist case against Walgreens, a Patterson case that the Adventist Church brought, and Walgreens denied him his right to have off on Sabbath, that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided not to take it. So the Supreme Court does not have to take cases. It doesn't want to. You have to get 4 justices to vote to take your case. So they only take about 70, 80 cases a year, and they get applications for, maybe thousands of cases. So, it's usually a shot in the dark. And so they turned down the Adventist case, but a year later we had another case, Gerald Groff, who was a Sunday keeper, and they decided to take that case. I don't know if that means anything, but it ends up helping Seventh-day Adventists anyways. So they took the case to look at the definition of undue hardship. And so what they did was we got a 9-0 decision in our favor where the court said, no, undue hardship means something of significant burden or expense. And so it strengthened the laws to help Seventh-day Adventists and help all people be able to practice their religion and not lose their job because of it. And so now an employer cannot refuse to accommodate your religious beliefs unless it would be some sort of significant burden or cost to the employer. And so it makes it a lot harder for the employer to get out of accommodating. So that case has been really helpful in all of my COVID cases. I have a lot of COVID vaccine accommodation cases that I'm doing right now, people who are fired because they wouldn't get the jab for religious reasons. And so, this case, this Groff versus DeJoy decision came out in 2023, which raised the burden. And so all these employers that were firing people for not getting the COVID shot in violation of their religious beliefs, it made it a lot harder on them to do that. And so it's been very helpful in that context, and also in all my cases, it's been very helpful to have. So that's a good way in which we have seen the law move recently. There's another case I want to point out is the case of Kim Davis. Anybody familiar with her? She was a county clerk for Rowan County in Kentucky, and in 2015, when the United States Supreme Court decided the Obergefell decision, where they found that same-sex marriage, there was a constitutional right to that, she said, well, as the county clerk, this is against my religious beliefs, I can't issue marriage licenses. And so she refused to do that, and she was sued by the couple, and the jury found that she had violated their constitutional right, and so she was ordered to pay $50,000 each in emotional distress damages, and then $246,000 in attorney's fees and $14,000 in expenses because she wouldn't issue marriage license. So she appealed that and said, it's a violation of her constitutional right to freely practice her religion. And the Sixth Circuit just recently affirmed the district court and said, government officials, they can have private lives, but their own constitutional rights can't be a shield to allow them to violate the constitutional rights of others. And so it upheld the decision, finding her liable, even though she was following her religious convictions. And so I believe that will get appealed to the United States Supreme Court. Hopefully they'll take that. But it's an interesting dynamic because here the right to same-sex marriage is an unenumerated right. So in our Constitution, we have enumerated rights, those that are specifically listed, in our Bill of Rights. And then we have unenumerated rights, which are rights that aren't listed, but that courts have found that we still have a constitutional right to. And so there's no right. You pull out your pocket book of the Constitution. There's no enumerated right to marriage or same-sex marriage in the Constitution, so it's an unenumerated right. And so what the court's essentially finding is that this unenumerated right trumps the very First Amendment. The thing that was on the foremost of all of our founding fathers' mind is freedom of religion. So it's an interesting case, and I hope the Supreme Court takes it and upholds it. Just because you sign up for public office doesn't mean you give up your constitutional rights. So something to be on the lookout. Another case that just came down, I think it was last week, was Catholic Charities Bureau. Actually, I think it was Monday. Catholic Charities Bureau versus Wisconsin. In this case, Wisconsin exempts religious institutions from having to pay unemployment tax. And so the Catholic Charities Bureau asked for an exemption, and the Wisconsin government said, well, all you're doing is giving food to the poor and providing clothes. You're not really teaching religion, so you're not religious enough, and so you don't get it. And so that went up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and they said, yeah, I don't think you're really religious enough to deserve to be exempt. And so they appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court on Monday unanimously ruled that Wisconsin violated their First Amendment right. They said, Wisconsin had said that this Catholic Charities Bureau didn't qualify because its ministries and outreach to the poor were not religious enough. So the court and the state were deciding, what true religion looks like, right? And so they said, well, since they're not requiring you to sit in a Bible class in order to get a bowl of soup, it's not really religion. They're just giving out soup to whoever. You don't have to sit in Bible class to get one. And so I guess the state thought that you have to coerce people, we'll give you soup, but you got to sit in Bible class first. Maybe that's true religion. That's according to the state. That's what they think. So the Supreme Court struck it down, 9-0 decision, and they say that a law that differentiates between religions along theological lines is textbook denominational discrimination. And so they said, the state can't decide that certain ministries aren't religious enough because they do ministry than what the state thinks ministry should look like, right? And so that was a good case that we got, a good ruling that we just got from the Supreme Court. But we've also seen the Supreme Court recently erode the separation of church and state. And so I want to look at some cases there where we're seeing this erosion of separation of church and state happen. We know from the First Amendment is where our religious freedom comes from, and there's two parts to the First Amendment. To the religion part of the First Amendment. You also have free speech and freedom to assemble, freedom of the press in the First Amendment. But the religious part is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so we have two parts. We have the establishment part and we have the free exercise part. So that the government can't establish a religion, but not just that. It says it cannot make a law respecting an establishment of religion. In fact, when you go back to the Constitutional Congress, that convention there, they actually tried to make the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. But they said, no, that's too narrow. We don't want the federal government establishing a church, picking, the Baptist church is the church of the country. But we also don't want them even making a law respecting an establishment of religion. So even if it makes a law that, advances one religion over another, or degrades a religion underneath another. We don't want that either. And so they made it broader by saying no law respecting an establishment of religion. And so that's the Establishment Clause. The Free Exercise Clause then also prohibits the government from making a law that doesn't allow you to freely exercise your religious beliefs, like saying you have to work on Saturdays or you have to worship on Sundays. That would impact the free exercise of your religious beliefs. And so for over 200 years, our Constitution has held this separation of church and state. And it's always been that the question has always been, when may the government aid religion without violating the Establishment Clause? But we'll see in a little bit that the Supreme Court has changed that to say now that the Constitution requires the state to help religion. One key case that really changed the Establishment Clause, changed the way that the courts view the Establishment Clause, was decided in 2022. And that was the Kennedy versus Bremerton case. You guys remember Coach Kennedy? I don't know, it made national news. Anybody remember hearing about this case where he'd pray on the 50-yard line at the end of the high school football games? And so the high school shut it down and said, Mr. Kennedy, you're not allowed to do that. That's, it coerces the students, and plus you're on the clock. You're supposed to be there coaching. You can pray on your own time in your office, but you can't, do it out there on the field. And so they were concerned about, students being felt compelled to pray with their coach because he was in a position of authority over him. And so they said, there's a violation of the Establishment Clause. As a public school, we're run by the government. We can't be endorsing Christian prayer. And so they told him, you can't do it or we'll fire you. And so he did it anyways, got fired. That went up to the United States Supreme Court. It also happened to be the same year, 2022, that the Roe versus Wade decision was overturned. And so that decision got all the attention. This decision, kind of was in the background more so because of that. But this one, I think, has far greater implications for us than reversing the constitutional right to abortion. This one really opened the floodgates for what we're seeing now happen in America. And so what the Supreme Court did in this case is they changed how the court would decide what is a violation of the Establishment Clause. So before that, it was called the Lemon Test, and it said that the law must have a secular purpose, its primary effect cannot advance or inhibit religion, and it cannot foster entanglement of government and religion. And so a law had to pass that three-part test in order to not run afoul of the Establishment Clause. And so in the Bremerton decision, Coach Kennedy versus City of Bremerton, the court did away with that test, and they said, look, we're going to look at the history and tradition of the United States, and if we allowed it in our history and tradition, then it wasn't, we'll say it's not a violation of the Establishment Clause because it's something that, we used to allow. And so they replaced that Lemon Test with this new test looking at history and tradition. And so it's obviously a very subjective test. What history are you going to look at, Mr. Judge, and what traditions are you going to look at to decide if this is a violation of the Establishment Clause? We have a lot of things in our history and in the tradition of the United States that maybe run afoul of the Establishment Clause, but the problem is the Establishment Clause did not apply to the states until well after the Civil War, when the 14th Amendment came, applying the Constitution to the states. But then even after that, the Supreme Court did not integrate the First Amendment until decades later. And so you have all this history and tradition of decades from the beginning of America until at least the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, where states could violate the Establishment Clause. States had pastors on salary. States had official religions of the state. This is how the Constitution got passed in the first place, is because you had all these different states that had their own state religion, and they didn't want the federal government telling them, Maryland didn't want the federal government telling them they couldn't be Catholic, or, Pennsylvania that, they couldn't be Quakers, or whatever their state religion is. They didn't want the federal government telling them that they could not, that they had to adopt a different religion. And so you had all these states that had religion in the government. Some even had religious tests in order to be able to vote. You couldn't, some states you couldn't be Catholic or a Jew or to hold public office or vote. And so they had, religious tests and religious laws that they were enforcing. And so are we going to go back to that time? Is that the history and tradition that we're going to look at? And so what we have seen, something else before I go on, actually. What was interesting is in this Kennedy versus Bremerton case, they said that, we're going to look at history and tradition. And then they say, like we did in the McGowan case. And the McGowan versus Maryland case was a 1961 decision where the United States Supreme Court found that Sunday closing laws were constitutional. So I thought, wow, that is very interesting. Our current Supreme Court makeup has found the Sunday law, at least the first stage of it, to be constitutional. They specifically cited the McGowan versus Maryland case as still being good law and as an example of the history and tradition of laws that affect religion in the United States that are okay. And so they've already said that, if a state wants to shut everything down on Sunday, that McGowan case is still good law. And so this has opened up the floodgates. And so because of this case is while we are seeing all the states pushing now for Bible reading in school and for prayers in school and in Congress and state legislators, and the Ten Commandments being publicly displayed. You guys notice, this popping up in the news in different states and places? All that is happening is because of the Bremerton case where the Supreme Court said, we're going to, change how we look at the Establishment Clause, and if we allowed it in the history and tradition of this country, we'll allow it now. And so all these states have said, hey, we allowed Bible reading in the past. That's our history and tradition. Displaying the Ten Commandments, that's our history and tradition. Prayer, that's our history and tradition. And so they have, you've seen, at least 15 states so far move to enforce religious Christian requirements in the public arena, whether it's public schools, teaching to children, or on public property, etc. And so right now, for Christians, it's open season at the Supreme Court, right? And so that's why all these legislators are being passed. Now, what's not in our history and tradition? Well, reading the Quran. That's not our history and tradition, so we don't have to worry about that, right? There's all these Christian values, which is, a good thing. I'm all for people being Christian, and I think, Americans need to read the Bible more, but should the state be the one enforcing that? Right? And which Bible are they reading? Are they reading the Catholic Bible? And which set of Ten Commandments? The Jewish Ten Commandments, the Christian Ten Commandments, the Catholic Ten Commandments, they're all different. Which Ten Commandments are we going to display? And then what version? Was going to be the NIV, the King James Version, New King James Version, right? And then the teachers, what ideology are they going to bring when they're teaching the fourth commandment? What Sabbath are they going to be teaching about, right? So you can see the problems when government starts to meddle in Christianity. You can see the problems that it leads to. And so, for Christians, it's like, this is great. There's no history and tradition of other religions in America that are taking over, like, Buddhism or Muslim. So we can't, a state can't pass a law saying you have to read the Quran, but they can pass a law saying you have to read the Bible because that's in our history and tradition. So that wouldn't violate the Establishment Clause. So you can see how this new test favors Christianity. And so you have all these states that are pushing for Christian symbols being displayed in the public arena. This is Louisiana. It became the first state after the Coach Kennedy case to require the Ten Commandments to be displayed in every public school classroom, from kindergarten up until state-funded universities. And the Governor Landry of Louisiana, said when he signed the law, he said, if you want to respect the rule of law, you have to start with the original lawgiver, Moses. I was like, wait a second. When I heard that, I was like, I don't think Moses was the original lawgiver. I thought he went up the mountain and got the law from someone else. You see, so they already have it wrong. The states already got it wrong. They can't even get the law signed and get it right. And, and we're supposed to trust them with teaching this to our kids, right? And so, they're requiring it to be displayed there. And it's got to be a certain version of it. So, it's that seems, just completely running afoul of Establishment Clause principles, because now the state is picking which version is the most accurate, right? As the state a theological body, are they the ones that to decide what version of the Ten Commandments is the most accurate? And I think it sends the wrong message. Looking at the Ten Commandments isn't going to change anybody's heart, right? It's the power of the Holy Spirit working that changes people's hearts. In Romans 3:20 it says, by the deeds of the law will no flesh be justified. And so, even if the atheistic student saw the law and decided to keep it, if they still don't believe in Jesus, right, and doesn't spring from their heart, to follow his righteousness and accept his righteousness, they're still like the Pharisees, right? Those whitewashed tombs. And so this is why it's a counterfeit idea. Now, Louisiana also is requiring "In God We Trust" to be displayed in every classroom as well. Now, is "In God We Trust" part of our history and tradition? Well, it depends. Depends on what history and tradition you look at. Who knows when "In God We Trust" came about on our money? Anybody? Well, it was actually in the 1950s. It's the 1950s that Eisenhower put it on all U.S. currency and put it on stamps as well. But it actually goes back to the time of Abraham Lincoln. So, the Civil War was starting, and the North wanted God to be on their side. And so all these pastors went to Abraham Lincoln and said, hey, we need to put "In God We Trust" on our money. We need to have that be our motto. Well, he wanted, not on our money. They went to Abraham Lincoln and wanted to change the Constitution and put "In God We Trust" in the Constitution. And we're trying to do that, but Lincoln refused to go along with it. And in order to appease the pastors, he said, okay, you can put it on coins. And so they put it on coins. And there was quite an uproar, actually. People thought it was a little sacrilegious to put it on a coin, some money. But so they didn't put it on dollar bills at the time. They just put it on coins. And then in the 1950s, Eisenhower required it to be put on all U.S. currency. And so is that part of our history and tradition? Or is it not? What are we looking at, like when the founding of the Constitution was? And so you can see how it could be subjective. What is our history and tradition? It really depends on what the judge decides is our history and tradition. And so Kentucky, back in 1971, they had put up a 6-foot-tall monument of the Ten Commandments. And in 2002, the federal court said, this is unconstitutional, a violation of the Establishment Clause. Well, just earlier this year, because of the Kennedy versus Bremer decision, Kentucky State Legislature voted, hey, let's put it up anyways. Laws changed, and so they voted and it passed, and so now they've put it back up, the Ten Commandments, or in the process of doing that. There's a lawsuit about it saying, hey, the court already told them they couldn't do this back in 2002, and so that's working its way through the courts to see what happens. So it's interesting how we're seeing, religion being brought in due to this change in the constitutional understanding of the Establishment Clause. We know Ellen White talks about how the Constitution will be eroded, which is what they will have to do in order to bring a Sunday law, is erode the Constitution. So what is our response to this? And this is something I've struggled with, and maybe you have better insight, because is Bible reading a good thing? Of course, right? Ten Commandments? Hey, who loves the Ten Commandments more than Seventh-day Adventists, right? No one keeps it better, right? And then what about prayer? Prayer, of course, prayer is necessary, right? And so how do we respond, when government is trying to enforce these things? We know that they're good, but they're not good to be enforced, right? It reminds me of the story of Nebuchadnezzar, where everyone was forced to bow to the image, and then when the 3 Hebrew worthies did it, and Jesus appears, and they come out of the fire, then Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, everyone, now you have to worship that God. If you don't, I'm going to make your house a dunghill, right? Or an ash heap or whatever. And so, he then forces the right religion, but forcing religion is never right. And so, it makes me think about what should be our response in this. And the same thing was happening during the time of Ellen White, when they were trying to enforce Bible reading in public schools back then as well. She says, writing in a letter to A.T. Jones, she says, well, I do not see the justice nor right in enforcing by the law the bringing of the Bible to be read in public schools. Yet there are some things which burden my mind in regard to our people making prominent their ideas on this point. These things, I am sure, will place us in a wrong light before the world. Cautions were given me on this point. She says, I think the law-making powers will carry their point in this particular, and it is very essential that as a people we take the greatest care that no provocation be given our enemies, which they will make capital of against us as a people in a future crisis, in the matter of opposing so good a work as the introduction of the Bible in the public schools. And so Ellen White counseled A.T. Jones basically, because he was speaking pretty boldly against it, maybe this shouldn't be our main point. We don't want to cause a division, when, God, obviously his word is powerful, right? And maybe can work through that. And so, we're supposed to approach the topic with caution. But I think with our vote, and warning people of the path that this is heading is something that we can do, warning them that, this has grave implications on the separation of church and state. The problem is a lot of these people don't believe that there should be separation of church and state in America. I go to different religious liberty conferences, and there's some very passionate people. In fact, the Groff case, I worked with the lead attorney who also handled the Coach Kennedy versus Bremerton case. We worked on the case together, but they very much see this nation as being a Christian nation and wanting to make it Christian again. And so, and they're very sincere people as well. And so we need to be cautious in that, but I think also explaining to them that if we don't have a separation of church and state, it doesn't lead to this, the promised land. I think they think that this is going to bring us back to the promised land if we make America a Christian nation. It's a great quote that I love. The great controversy. It says, "The union of church with the state be the degree never so slight. While it may appear to bring the world nearer to the church, does in reality but bring the church nearer to the world." So we think that, if we do all these things, uniting with the state, we think, it's going to bring all the people to be like the church. But what it's really doing is bringing the church to be like the world. And we see this, throughout, if you study ancient Rome, Roman history, where, the Christian church made concessions to Rome and to Constantine, and they were thinking that they were bringing more people into the church, and requiring people to come into the church. But what did that do? It filled the church, but it filled them with hypocrites, right? You had a bunch of people that were in there because they had to be in there, or because they were given money to be in there. It said that Constantine gave a gold coin to everyone that got baptized as a Christian. I don't know if that's true or not, but, be like, sure, I'll get baptized. Yeah, sign me up. I'll take a gold coin. And so you can see how people were doing it for the wrong reason. And so then it fills the church with a bunch of hypocrites, backsliders, or not even backsliders, right? Just a bunch of worldly people. And then when they get put on committees or in leadership, and you see this progression when you read the story of the 7 churches of Revelation, of how, they compromised, and then after compromising, you're seeing that they're even allowing them to teach the doctrines of Balaam and the Nicolaitans, and then the Jezebel, is using it as an example, becoming the teacher. And so you're seeing this progression in the church where they are compromising, and it ends up killing and destroying the church. And so we need to make sure that we are not compromising with the world or the state to try to push Christian ideology, because it's not through the state that makes people Christian. We can't make people Christian by legislation, but it's only by the power of the Holy Spirit. All right, now this quote is from The Great Controversy, page 455, and this actually talks about how when the churches go to the state to enforce their Christian ideas and to get money from the state, then Protestant America will have formed an image of the Roman hierarchy. So the image of the beast that's talked about there in Revelation chapter 13 is when the Christian churches go to the state to enforce Christianity, to get it to be taught, to get it to be decreed. And then when they go to the state to get money to sustain their institutions, that is the image of the beast that is talked about in Revelation chapter 13. And she says, soon after that happens, the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result. If you're not going along with the enforced Christian decrees, then you will suffer under civil penalty. And so we saw this change happen over the past handful of years, where before this, the Constitution prevented the state from giving financial aid to churches. But now the Supreme Court has ruled that the state is required to give money to churches. Whenever it benefits a public organization, it has to benefit a religious one as well. And so this change happened, the first step of it happened in 2017 in the Trinity Lutheran case. In that case, the state of Missouri was running a church, or the state of Missouri was running a program where they offered to redo playgrounds with recycled tire scraps. And so you could go and ask the state of Missouri to redo your playground. Schools could. Well, this church, the Trinity Lutheran, said, hey, our playground needs redone. That peewee gravel, that's real old. Look at all the weeds in it. And so they applied to the state of Missouri and said, hey, we would like, our playground resurfaced with recycled tires. And the state of Missouri said, no, it's a violation of the Establishment Clause. We cannot give, state funds to fund religion. And so the church sued the state and said, what, you're not going to give me the money? Taking you to court. So they sued and went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court held that it was discriminatory. The state was discriminating against them because they were a church. And that, it's not even for a religious purpose. It's just a playground, right? What's the big deal? And so they forced the state of Missouri to use taxpayer dollars to fund the Trinity Lutheran's playground resurfacing project. And, we might think, it's just a playground, what's a big deal, right? But this was the first step leading to the requirement of government to fund religion. Sotomayor wrote in her dissent, she said, the court today profoundly changes that relationship between church and state by holding for the first time, this is the first time in our country's history that the Constitution requires the government to provide public funding directly to a church. Its decision slights both our precedents and our history. So I find it interesting there, the Supreme Court wasn't looking at the history and tradition of our nation. Instead, they just said, you know what, it's discrimination. And state of Missouri, you have to provide it. So a couple of years later, June 2020, the Espinoza case came along, and in that case, the state of Montana had a program where it provided tuition assistance to parents for their children to attend private schools. And some parents wanted to send their children to Christian schools, and the state said, no, we can't do that. That's funding religious education. It's a violation of the Establishment Clause. And so they denied the help, the funds to go towards that. And so the parents sued. That went up to the United States Supreme Court. And in 2020, the court relied on the Trinity Lutheran case and said, this is discriminatory for the state of Montana not to fund these children to go to religious schools. It's saying it's discriminating against them merely because of their status that they're religious. It says we don't even know if the religious schools were even teaching religion. And so, you're just discriminating against them because they're a religious institution, and you can't do that. And so the Supreme Court, took that second step. Now they're funding a religious institution for maybe religious purposes, if they're teaching religion there. And so then in 2022 was the Carson versus Macon Supreme Court decision. And there, the state of Maine, they got wise. They said, okay, we have this voucher program. We will provide funding for parents to send their kids to private schools, but not to private schools that teach religion to their students. So we're not discriminating against religious schools. We'll send it to a religious school as long as they don't teach religion. And so they're trying to get around the Supreme Court's decision. And so, people sued the state of Maine, and that went up to the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court, relying on its Trinity Lutheran Espinoza decision, said no, the government must support religion anytime it supports a secular activity. It has to also support religious activities of the same nature. And so there, the court, what was interesting, the Trinity Lutheran case, the Supreme Court said, well, it's only a playground, it's a non-religious, it's a secular purpose. Now here we are in Carson versus Macon, where it's clearly a religious purpose, teaching religion to kids, and the Supreme Court has said that you have to fund that if you fund it for other secular schools. And so the dissent there said, we have never previously held what the court holds today, namely that a state must use state funds to pay for religious education. And so you can see the shift that is happening to where the government is now being required, because of churches going to the state, going to the government, the courts, for money to sustain their institutions, that now the government is required to fund religious institutions. So after this case came out, Maine said, fine, we'll fund religious education, but you can't discriminate based on LGBTQ plus principles. And so they said, we'll give money to religious institutions. You can teach religion, but you can't discriminate based on sex and gender. So now that's being litigated in the Supreme Court. These schools, religious institutions are suing, saying, hey, we should be able to do that. And so we'll see what happens with that. So because of this line of cases, the Catholic Church said, well, wait a minute. We should start a Catholic public school. We have the state fund it. We'll teach Catholic doctrine, and kids in our district will have to come, and it'll be totally funded by the state. That's a good idea, right? The Catholic Church is really good about using other governments for money, right? That's been their modus operandi since the beginning, is using the armies of other governments, using the funds of other governments. And so what they did was they went to the state of Oklahoma and found a sympathetic Department of Education, and the State School Board of Education of Oklahoma voted 3-2 to approve the first publicly funded public school, Catholic charter school. And, this went up to the state attorney general was like, wait a second, we can't do this. There's a violation of the Constitution. And so you had the governor of Oklahoma backing the Catholic public school and the Board of Education backing it, but then you had the Oklahoma Attorney General suing itself, basically, suing this Catholic charter school, saying you can't do this. It's a violation of the Constitution. So it was a very interesting case. Went up to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and they said, no, this isn't constitutional, right? You can't have a public Catholic school. Charter schools are by definition public schools. The government of the state is what funds it. They, decide what the curriculum is, and so it's under Oklahoma law. It is a public school, and so the Catholic Church appealed to the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court. And I was very nervous about this case. I thought this was going to be the first time in our history that there is a public religious school. In fact, if you look back at this state, Virginia, that was the main issue in Virginia's Constitution, was where they were trying to pass a funding of religion here, and Madison was like, whoa, you can't do this. And Patrick Henry was trying to get Madison out of the way. And fortunately, Virginia, had its constitution respecting the establishment, or keeping from the establishment of religion, which is what the United States Constitution was then modeled off of. And so this was like this is our history and tradition at the very beginning, right? But the attorney arguing this, I met him at a religious liberty conference in LA last year, and he was like, oh, we're going to win the case. That's what he told me. In fact, he had clerked for Justice Alito. So he already had an inside track. And Amy Coney Barrett, one of our Supreme Court justices, it's her friend at Notre Dame School of Law that helped set up the first Catholic public school. So that was what made it very fortunate, because she then had to recuse herself from the case. So we only had 8 justices that actually heard this case, and they just decided last week it was a tie, 4-4. And so the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruling upheld that it was unconstitutional. Had Amy Coney Barrett been on there, it would not have come out that way. So I think it merely kicks the can for another day when it arises from another state where she's not compromised, and then they would have that 5th justice to allow a public religious school. So we were very fortunate, and this just came out, I think, 2 weeks ago, where the Supreme Court was basically hung, in a 4-4 vote. They didn't say which 4 vote which way. So I don't know who was that 4th justice. I'm sure the 3 liberals were, voting against it based on listening to oral argument. But anyways, it saved us from another day, because that would have been just a complete violation of the separation of church and state. So what is the end goal of all this, of getting religious principles taught by state law and getting funding for religion? What is the end goal of all that? Ellen White has this quote here in The Great Controversy. She says, in the movements now in progress in the United States, to secure for the institutions and usages of the church the support of the state. So the movements that are happening to get support from the state for our religious institutions, she says Protestants are following in the steps of the papists. Nay, more, they are opening the door for the papacy to regain in Protestant America the supremacy which she has lost in the old world. And that which gives greater significance to this movement is the fact that the principal object contemplated is the enforcement of Sunday observance. So the principal object contemplated, all that they're doing, this groundwork to get funding of religious institutions and to get religion to be taught and enforced in the state, its whole purpose is to get a national Sunday law. And so this is something that we have to keep an eye out on, and we know, like I said earlier, that the McGowan decision, that 1961 decision where the United States Supreme Court upheld Sunday closing laws, and that was a case where it was a criminal penalty. It was a crime to violate the Sunday laws. It wasn't a civil penalty. And so the guy had gone in to the store, and you were allowed to buy necessary items, like gasoline or tobacco, necessary things. But you were not allowed to buy a stapler and staples, which is what this man went to buy on Sunday. I don't know, maybe he was stapling his hymnal, or maybe his Bible fell apart. We don't know. But he wasn't allowed to buy a stapler and staples, and so the store wasn't allowed to sell it. And the store sold it, and somehow the state found out, and they held this they brought criminal prosecution against the store owner for selling stapler or whatever to this man. And so he claimed, hey, there's a violation of the Constitution, and that's where the Supreme Court held, no, you have that Sunday closing laws are not a violation of the Constitution. And that is where the Supreme Court held in that Bremerton case just a few years ago. Our current makeup of our Supreme Court said that is still good law. That does not violate the Establishment Clause. So anyways, that's my religious liberty update. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take some questions. Just ask that you keep it short, to less than a minute, please, so we can take everyone's questions. If there's a roving mic, okay. Maybe you can hang on to it. People talk shorter if you hold the mic than if they hold it. But happy to take any question. I don't know if I have all the answers. I can tell you I don't have all the answers, but if anybody has any questions about anything dealing with religious liberty. Yes, sir. Let's get a mic for you.
My question is regarding the laws regarding punishment, right? So is there a trend in terms of the cases, how people are supposed to be punished, like heretics, or what is the trend building up to the punishment of someone who violates these kinds of law?
There was an interesting case, and I think it was out of Iowa, where Iowa had a statute on public property of, I believe it was the 10 Commandments. And the court had said, hey, you can't just have the 10 Commandments by itself. And so they said, okay, we'll allow any statute, anybody wants to put up. Well, the Luciferian church said, oh, good. We'd like a statute of Baphomet. And so they told that to the state, and the state couldn't deny it. And so this is the problem when, you entangle church and state. And so on state property, you had the 10 Commandments, and then you had the Luciferian statute of Baphomet there. And this bothered this Christian man. And so he went there and tore down Baphomet and broke it in pieces. And they went after him criminally, not just for destroying the government property or whatnot, but they also went after him for a hate crime, saying that he, and so it enhanced the penalty that he got because they were labeling it a hate crime against people who follow, part of the Luciferian church. So that was, I don't know if that helps answer your question, but if you don't go along with the narrative, there could be a hate crime, that could be attached, that could enhance your penalty. So you can see that maybe in the way of maybe some Adventist understanding of prophecy in regards to, Catholicism and the different roles the papacy plays in the end times, how that could be considered hate speech someday. I don't know. Does that answer your question at all? Marginally?
I have one more. That sounds more like that guy was vandalizing.
Right.
If we stay out of their business, out of even government's business, I'm thinking more of the case, I think it was that the baker who refused to bake the cake for a homosexual couple or something like that. Is something similar like that. Do we see the trend, force against conscience, against people's, conscience, that doesn't allow them to violate religious, convictions, or in the case of pandemic, vaccinations? Obviously, that was another issue that's been more relevant,
Yeah. So there's the Masterpiece Cake Shop. Following up on that was the 303 Creative case. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that case, but 303 Creative was a website, a wedding website designer. She would make wedding websites for individuals, and she refused to do so for a couple that follows the LGBT lifestyle. And the state went after her to shut down her business, or actually I think she was wanting to get a license for her business, and they wouldn't allow it. Anyways, so she brought a lawsuit saying, that this violates her religious beliefs, to require her to use her business to promulgate something that clearly goes against her religious beliefs. And so that went up to the Supreme Court 2 years ago. They ruled that the government could not require her to express herself through her website designing in a way that was different than her religious convictions. And so in that aspect, the Supreme Court's been great. Our current makeup of the Supreme Court has been great on the free exercise clause. It's the establishment clause that they've really kind of degraded, and almost, it's almost nothing to it.
Jonathan, there's a case working its way through the system now. I believe it's called Chili's versus Salazar. It's a Christian, and Chili's is, I believe, the name of the gentleman who's a Christian marriage and family therapist, and he's challenging the law. I guess Colorado has some kind of law banning conversion therapy, and he's wanting to work with people of the LGBTQ community to restore them to a Christian lifestyle. That case is interesting to me because if he loses that case, I feel like it's open season against Christianity. I mean, the gospel is about transformation. I mean, yes, a lot of bad things have been done under the name of conversion therapy, but the gospel is about transforming the lives and souls. It's not about affirming things. So are you familiar with that case? I don't know if you are. If not, that's okay. But do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, that case is pending before the United States Supreme Court right now, and it's an interesting case where Colorado bans that sort of conversion therapy. There's also a case pending before the Supreme Court where Tennessee passed a law banning puberty blockers and surgeries to change for minors, that is. And so you're seeing this the head butting between Christian values and alternative lifestyle values happening, and those cases could have big implications for people, especially the Colorado one, people who have medical licenses. Something we saw with COVID too is that if you don't speak the narrative of the state, you'll get your license revoked or not be able to practice, and so really treads on people's rights to free speech. So I don't know what way the court's going to come out on that, but there are religious undertones to that, where, and it keeps people from being able to follow their religious convictions. What if the minor wants that therapy because they want help, but what it does is the state's saying, no, you're not allowed to get help, because we're deciding what is right ideology. And so it really does, it kind of is a religion case because it's the state picking a religious ideology of what is right, which is different than what God set up in the garden. So, the Supreme Court term ends the end of June, and so I expect to see decisions in that case, in the Tennessee case as well, by the end of June. Yes?
I want to ask, what is your take on, I know you talked about schools accepting like Title I funds. I am the principal for this school, and I've attended some of our principal council meeting. We have some schools that are accepting Title I funds. What advice would you give to the principals of the schools in the conference or in the the union? What advice would you give?
Yeah. Is that where it's like a voucher program where parents get to pick, and then, whichever school they pick, the funds go to that school?
Something like that, but I often get letters from the schools in the public schools in the area offering Title I funds to the school, and when I usually get that, I just throw it away. But it's just, what is the take? Because you have some Adventist schools that are taking Title I funds, whilst those who know better are not taking it.
Yeah. I think we have to be very careful, and I think what happened in Maine, and is happening in Maine, is a great example of that, where, they say, okay, we'll give you funding, but there's strings attached. You can't close your dorms to, people who have alternative lifestyles, or, you can't teach something that's discriminatory against the LGBT community or whatever. And so I think we have to be very careful about taking government funds if there are strings attached. And also, even if there aren't, could there be in the future? And have we built up such a reliance on those funds that then, unless, in the future they change something and, we're operating, and a great example of this is USAID, right? USAID. All these institutions were operating on government funds, and when Trump shut that down, even with ADRA, they were scrambling, right? They couldn't make payroll, and having trouble operating. And so, you get so used to the money coming from the state that, if they attach certain strings, say you only get this for this, or if they take it away, it could be problematic. So I think we have to be careful. For me personally, I think if it's the parent deciding, if the money follows the student, to me that's not a violation of the Establishment Clause, because the student's deciding what school they go to. It's not the state funding, just sending checks out directly to the school. And so that's, my personal belief or understanding, but I still think we have to be careful, because, if they ever do attach strings to it, or if there are any strings attached to it, we're better off not taking it. And God, let me ask you this. When was the greatest time in the Christian movement? Thinking back to history, when was the greatest time the Christian movement was just going all cylinders? Yeah, apostolic, right? The very beginning. How much government funding did they have? I mean, how did their kids go to school? Like, how did they afford to send their kids to school? And how did they keep their institutions running? And how did they send their missionaries, right? I mean, not only did they not have government funding, but they had opposition they were being persecuted by Israel, the nation, as well as by Rome. And so it was at that time that the church thrived and grew the best. So, God has the cattle on 1,000 hills. We don't need the state funding. It doesn't mean we can't use it. There's also examples in the Bible. You look at God using Medo and Persia to fund their return from exile and fund the building of the temple and building the wall around Jerusalem. And so you do see examples of God moving on the hearts of kings, to fund things. So I think, we have to be very careful. I think we need to pray about it. And, is this God leading? Is this God making the way? There was a time where, back in the days of Ellen White, where some king of a nation in Africa granted the Adventist church, I think it was a couple hundred acres or so to start an Adventist institution. And A.T. Jones was like, no, don't take it. It's a violation of separation of church and state, and was like just forcefully speaking out against it. And Ellen White wrote to Jones and said, you're wrong in this matter. This is a gift. We shouldn't, turn them away because, they're doing this out of love of their heart for the Adventist church because of the message that they had heard. And so I think in that case, when it's, a gift and people are grateful for what the church is doing, that there's clear direction, that it's okay to take gifts in that manner. And I think that's what God was moving on the heart of Xerxes there. And so, I think in other cases, though, we need to be careful. I saw a hand over there.
Just a clarification on Title I. The Title I is actually funds that are public funds to help disadvantaged students in school. Okay, so like if they needed extra tutoring, something like that. So that's really what that is for. But I will mention that the Chesapeake Conference at one time did receive funds, whereas that was government funding, and they gave it all back because there was that fine print that you were talking about that was in there. Is that, yes, you can have this money if you would do this and this, which would have been a violation of Adventist standards. But I do have a question here. The Establishment Clause as such, and just correct me if I'm wrong on it, what our founding fathers, when they actually put that in, is they were not against Christian principles being operated within the government. They were against having a state-funded church. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily, because that was one of the versions of the Establishment Clause. The first version, I don't know if it was the first, but one of them was that the government may not establish a religion. But they changed that to add, may not make a law respecting the establishment of the religion, to widen it, to broaden it, so that it wasn't just about establishing a church, but it was also other laws that would impact, either advancing or inhibiting a religion.
Yeah, so the follow-up question then would be, when the public school system started in this country, they used their language arts materials like the McGuffey Reader that was filled with Christian principles. 10 Commandments all the way through, Bible stories all the way through. That's how they learned how to read. And public and prayers in the school and Bible reading was just a common practice within the public schools of that time. So is it really better that they've done away with all that?
Right, so, public schools have been around since the beginning of this country, but they were run by the state. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Establishment Clause did not apply to the states. It only applied to the federal government. It wasn't until after the Civil War where the Constitution was changed, the 14th Amendment was passed, applying the Constitution to the state governments as well. And even after that, the Supreme Court was made up of many justices that were sympathetic to the South, and so they wouldn't even apply the Constitution to the states even after. They would refuse it when cases were brought before them, but only as the makeup of the Supreme Court shifted, decades later, that they applied the Constitution, through the 14th Amendment to the states. And so for, a lot of the history of the United States, when they were teaching, Bible reading, when they had prayer in public schools, there was no constitutional violation there because the Constitution wasn't applicable to the states at that point in time. And so that's why I think, if we're going to look at history and tradition, it's not really fair to look at that history and tradition because at that point in time, the Constitution wasn't applicable to the states.
Might be a follow-up question.
Yeah, I have a question. My question is about the job. When you apply for the job and then they give you the job, and after a couple of days, they change their schedule. And they say, they know I say I'm a Christian, okay? I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. I can walk in like Monday to Friday. But after that, they change. They want me to work in on the day I say I can work, like Friday to Saturday. They just let me go. What I have to do?
I didn't understand that all the way. So they let you go because you wouldn't work on Sabbath?
Yes.
How long ago was this?
Next couple, 1 week.
Okay. So you need to file this isn't legal advice, by the way. This is just recommendation.
What to do?
Is this recorded? So contact your religious liberty director at conference office or the union. Your pastor can put you in touch with them. You'll need to file a charge of discrimination with the EEOC. You can go on their website. That's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for the United States government. You can't bring a lawsuit until you file a charge with them and get what's called a notice of right to sue. But you should be able to contact your religious liberty director at the conference, and they'll walk you through the process, or the union. They'll put you in touch with the union director who will. And then if the union writing a letter from the church doesn't resolve it and get you your job back, then the church will fund the lawsuit for you to help you get your job back. And they'll put you in touch with an attorney that can help you do that. So reach out to the conference. You can ask your pastor. He can put you in touch with the right person. And, you have 90 days or actually, I don't know how many days you have in Virginia, but you have a short time frame to file a charge of discrimination with the EEOC. So I'd make sure you do that process very quickly, but the religious liberty director should be able to help you do that. Yes, over here.
My question's going back to our conversation a few questions ago, but you say when you're taking government money, you need to be really careful about when you take it because of the strings attached with it. But my question is, my initial gut reaction is don't ever take government money. But so the question is, how do you know if there's strings attached? So let's say there's nothing in writing. Can the government really still come back and say, look, we're giving you the money so you're no longer going to get it because you're not behaving in the manner we want you to, or you're doing something against, our wishes? So how do you really know if something is, does it have to be in writing in order for them to cut you off? Or if you've taken money from them, or if there's nothing in writing, do they still have a right to do that? I mean, how do you know if you're going to get into a conflict with them?
Right.
I'm not sure I'm asking that very clearly.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the hard part. Like, you don't know. Sometimes it is in writing, but, they can change the writing and change it. And, which then you would either have to, stop receiving it or maybe even have to pay it back. I don't know. Sure. Anything's possible. So yeah, I think you have to be careful. I think, my initial reaction is the same as yours, just don't take the funds in the first place, God's blessed us. We can be funding our own schools. We can be funding our churches, our missionaries, and I don't know that we need government funding to do that. And I think it puts us on a stronger foothold as well when we're arguing in the end times for the separation of church and state. If we can say, well, we don't even take the state money, and so I think we undercut ourselves by taking the handouts that come, when eventually we're going to have to be like, hey, we need separation of church and state here.
Patty, just to answer a little bit of that question as well, going back to Title I, okay, and using government funds to help a disadvantaged student, is that, and it's different in different school districts. Let me explain. One is that I remember talking to the public school district in the county that I was in. I said, how far, with the Title I funds, what freedom and what leverage do I have as an educator and the principal of the school to be able to use these funds, and what can I do? Can I find my own teacher? Yes, you can. Is this going to have any impact on our religious freedom here in the school and the standards that we have? No, it will not. And so I was able to actually hire an Adventist teacher, okay, to do that Title I, that tutoring that needed to be done in that school. I went to another district. I was vice principal, working with the principal in that school. We go to the other district, and they did not allow that. So it is, you're right. You have to be very, very careful with those types of things. And it should never, should our schools have to be dependent, or any of our institutions be dependent, like we saw what happened with ADRA, be dependent on government funding. Mm-hmm. It should never happen that way. At least that's from my experience. But I would like to know your thoughts on this, because I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, what was the history or the government understanding of our founding fathers regarding Christian principles. And this thought came up to my mind. I'd like to hear your assessment of this, because I know that John Adams, who was basically the quarterback for the founding of our country, okay? He was the one that people didn't like him, but he got things happening and put the people in place and stuff there. But he did make this statement. He says, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that you look at the Treaty of Tripoli. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where the United States, and this was at the founding, had a treaty with Tripoli, and in that they said, we are not a Christian nation. And I think that was right, and that was our founders, that we were a nation of Christians, but we're not a Christian nation. And I think there's a difference there, and I think we need to remember that difference and to maintain that difference. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think that, going as far as morality goes, I don't think it's the government job to enforce morality. It's the government job to enforce civility. But they can't make someone moral. They can't, morality is what comes from your heart and why you do what you do. And so, there's a lot of people that say, well, the first 4 commandments, those are God's, we don't touch those, but the last 6, well, those that God has allowed government to regulate. And I was like, well, not really. The last 6 is commandments about morality, right? It's not just don't commit adultery, don't kill. Jesus said it's deeper than that. You say don't commit adultery. If you commit adultery, you sin. But I say if you lust after a woman in your heart, you've already broken the commandment. And so the last 6 commandments are also about morality. And it's not the judge, it's not the state's prerogative to judge morality. No one in here can be fined because they covet their neighbor's house or car or wife, right? You can't go to jail for that, But if you actually steal something or take something that's not yours or kill somebody, that is a violation of civility. And that the government can regulate, how man, interacts with his neighbor. And so I think, we have to be careful not to, have the government start regulating morality because then it steps into the prerogative of God.
I think the church has its work cut out for it. If the Constitution works better for moral, spiritual people, it's up to the church to keep proclaiming the gospel and winning converts to Christ. So it's valuable. The statement's valuable, but ultimately it lands with us, the believer, to share. I wanted to just, a couple of quick things, just reinforce the statement you shared earlier regarding Ellen White's comments to A.T. Jones pertaining to Bibles in schools. She says that there were some things shown me in reference to the words of Christ, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things which are God's, placing the matter where the church has no right to enforce anything of a religious character upon the world. Yet, in connection with this were given words of caution. If such a law were to go into effect, the Lord would overrule it for good, that an argument should be placed in the hands of those who keep the Sabbath in their favor to stand on the Bible foundation in reference to the Sabbath of the 4th commandment. So you asked a valuable question. How do we address these matters in light of what the Lord showed her and how this could end up working in favor for Sabbath keepers when people have access and are actually reading something. They may have it in their homes, maybe not being read, but potentially being read in school, and they're confronted with just the basic text of the Scripture. Not that we would promote it or encourage it per se, but we do have to be very careful. Anyway, getting to my question.
Sure.
Was that a minute already? I don't know. And I don't want to go too far back. I want to talk about COVID, if I can, real quick. Sure. I was in California, Sacramento, in fact, California at the time when COVID happened. And there was a lot of discussion, talk coming from the church, particularly religious liberty departments, when churches were shut down, among other things, but other things were not, that this is not a religious liberty issue. Ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that there was, it had to do with the Establishment Clause, that there was a violation. And I have not read, I've not seen or heard any recognition that potentially some of our religious liberty departments were in error, or even what their views are pertaining to that ruling. I think when we think about COVID, there are a lot of fractions and friction related to that time, but that one was a problem for a lot of Adventists, particularly where I was in Sacramento, that this was not a religious liberty issue when marijuana places and alcohol joints and big box stores, you could go in there freely and happily, but you couldn't worship. In fact, there was a time you couldn't even sing in church. We did that for a week and said, this is wrong, there's something wrong with this. Is there any, did the church recognize, at least our religious liberty departments, the value of the Supreme Court ruling, that there was a violation, or no, or do you know?
Yeah, I don't. I think, it depends on who you talk to. I work very closely with the Pacific Union. Alan Reinach, I'm sure you know him if you were there at Sacramento. But he has definitely recognized that, the path chosen was not the correct path. In fact, the Pacific Union funded my lawsuit against the County of Los Angeles on behalf of a physician assistant, Catherine Katz, who was working there at the county hospital. And she was fired because of her religious beliefs against the vaccine. And so I took that case, and the union actually funded the case. And we went and got a trial win. She got $911,000 awarded to her for back pay and emotional distress damages, and the court ordered the county to reinstate her to her position. So, by the union funding that case and other cases has been a reversal of what previously, the religious liberty departments were willing to do. At first they were like, we're not helping anybody. We can't help you because your religious beliefs don't align, with the Adventist Church, which didn't make a whole lot of sense to me because I've been doing religious liberty with the Adventist Church. I don't work for them, but with them, and we've been representing Muslims and Sikhs and Jews and all sorts of people that don't follow our sort of religious beliefs. So, it was a little, I think it was just so political, and I don't really know what the driving force was, but it was disheartening, the position that, the religious liberty departments took. I haven't seen any apology or anything yet. I don't expect to get one, but it would be nice. For a lot of people who lost their job, I can't tell you how many emails I got from HR directors, sending me that quote from the Adventist Review saying, well, your client's church doesn't even believe in, this, so how can they have a sincere religious belief? And so it was problematic. A lot of people lost their jobs because of the church's statement. And it was unfortunate that happened. Fortunately, the law respects people as an individual. It doesn't matter what their institution believes. And so we were able to file lawsuits and get people's jobs back or get them a nice pile of money, for their hardship. But I think it would help with the healing of our church if there was some sort of recognition that, hey, we took the wrong path, made a mistake here, kind of like the church did, joining up Nazi Germany, siding with the Hitler and all, and, decades later apologize for that. It'd be nice if we didn't have to wait decades later, but yeah, so.
Yeah, I have two questions. They're going to be quick. I hear what you say about vouchers. I think, is there anything in the works where instead of saddling the church by taking government funds, but it would be for an individual, they would give, if you wanted a voucher, give it to that family so that they don't have to saddle the church or their school, the school that they're going, the private school, with accepting government funds that would be given to the family. Is there anything in the ways where they're going to be able to do if vouchers are issued to families instead of institutions?
Yeah, the school vouchers is all state dependent. So it's really up to the state legislator and what they have voted on. Some states don't allow vouchers at all. Other states, I think there are some that give it directly to the parents. They have to show proof of enrollment. Other states give it to the schools that the parents choose. And so it just really depends on what that state legislature has decided. It's not a federal government thing. And I don't think it ever will be. I mean, especially with the Trump administration, they're wanting to shut down the Department of Education altogether. So, they're wanting to get out of that business altogether and just leave it to the states. So I don't know that there ever will be like a direct thing, but I think, the better choice is, it would be nice if it went to the parents, but then you could have, fraud there, because then people could say, yeah, my kids are in this school, and, send me money, or, that's what we saw with that paycheck protection program during COVID, where this guy started like 50 LLCs real quick and applied for the loan for all of them, and next thing you know, you see him on Facebook driving a Lamborghini and, all sorts of things. This, big yacht he bought with all the money he got from the government. Of course, the FBI went after him, and he's now spending the whole time in prison and not with his Lamborghini anymore. But, I think it opens it up to, it could be some fraud issues if you're sending it directly to the parents as opposed to the school.
Yeah. And my second question is, and I'm not being confrontational, I'm not trying to use you as a sounding board, but do we really practice religious liberty even within the church itself? And my question would be is, when they posted with the jab, with getting the vaccination, where they say, yeah, that we find no problem with taking it, but we do support a conscience. An individual, what he believes is conscious to him, but yet we leave it posted and people are losing their jobs. I mean, it seems like religious liberty, we talk about religious liberty and to the secular world, but inside the confines of our own church, it seems like that we don't play by the same rules. Do you understand what, and I don't want to put you in a spot where...
I think, talking about the reaffirmation statement, if that's what you're referring to, I think it did have some issues, religious liberty-wise. It's not, religious liberty isn't just religious liberty for what, the church believes, or for what the executive committee or whoever, the AdCom committee believes. But religious liberty is for the individual what they believe, and not just for Adventists, for all individuals. And so, for us to say, for a church body or anybody to say, this is or this is not a religious liberty issue, I think just completely misses the mark with religious liberty. Like, who are we to say what is or is not a religious liberty issue? Because that would be us stepping between God and man. That's us saying, which is very Catholic. The Catholic Church is, we're in between God and man. And so, it's not for an institution or a body to decide what is a religious thing. It's, how is the Holy Spirit impressing you or leading you? And that's what courts have found. I mean, you look at, is killing animals, what would you guys say? Is killing animals a religious liberty issue? What do you think? Who says yes? Who says no? Who says I don't know? So there was this case out of Florida, the city of Hialeah, and the city council heard that there was the church of Lukumu Babaluai. I don't know if anybody's ever been to that church, but they sacrifice animals there as part of their regular service. And the city council was appalled that was happening there inside city limits, and so they passed a law, no killing of animals inside city limits, within our jurisdiction, except for rodent extermination, rats, feeding rats or bunnies to your pet snake, or hunting. They had all these exceptions to the list. So basically, the only way you couldn't kill animals was if you were doing it for a worship service, because of the long list of exceptions they had to this law. So, they were targeting that church of Lukumi Babaluai, and that went up to the United States Supreme Court, and they said, look, this is a religious liberty issue for that church. It might not be for you guys. You might think it's detestable and you don't like it, but it's still a religious liberty issue for them, and you need to respect their right to freedom of religion. And so I tell that because, a lot of times we think, oh, this isn't a religious liberty issue. Well, it might not be for you. Getting the vaccine, that wasn't a religious liberty issue for a lot of people. But for a lot of other people, it was. Wearing a skirt, that's not a religious liberty issue for a lot of people. But for a lot of other people, it is. And so I think it's wrong for us to make statements saying this is or this is not when we don't know how God's convicting that person. We don't know, why they are doing what they are doing. And so I think, our church missed the mark by saying, the vaccines are not a religious liberty issue because maybe it wasn't for the AgCom. But there were a lot of Adventists where it was.
Well, one statement I want to ask you about is I heard that through our schools they're talking about how we're going to handle LGBTQ+. Why are we even having this conversation if we're separate? This is how we believe, and we shouldn't make consolations or open our doors. If they want to send their children, but this is how we believe. We don't need to accommodate their beliefs. I don't understand why we're even having these talks. I've heard that several conferences are having talks, how are we going to accommodate? The way to accommodate, no, we just, no, this is how we believe, and no, we love you, but this is how we believe, and we're not going to go ahead and change the way we teach.
I'm not aware of that happening, but yeah, I think there's obviously principles with the Bible that would conflict with that, but I don't know what exactly I haven't heard of that happening, so I can't speak to that. Yes, sir.
Just real quickly, I guess we're coming down the home stretch, but could you outline for us just briefly, as individuals and as a church, some things we can do to continue to promote religious liberty and keep it in the forefront, not just of our membership, but also our community?
Yes, thank you. That's a great closing question. Unless there are any more. But yeah, I think a great thing to do is Liberty Magazine, and there's going to be a great article in this next issue. Anyways, sorry. But I wrote an article about COVID and vaccine, so it might be great. But you can read it. Anyways, so sending that to your local legislator, your local judge, you can sign them up, send them a copy, and get them on the mailing list, and I think that helps. I think having relationships with your local representative, going to them and saying, because your local representatives are in tune with the needs of your community. And so I think if we go to them as a church and we say, hey, we're the local Seventh-day Adventist church, what can we do to better our community? And ask them, what needs do you see in our community that our church can help fill? And I think that would be do great to build bridges with the legislators so that when there are those hard questions coming up later, we already have those connections with them. Oh yeah, you're the Adventist church that helped us do this project on this side of town or whatever, feeding the homeless or whatever it is. Then we can have those conversations when, Sunday legislation or other things come up that impact our church or our school, and so I think being involved in our community and talking to our legislator, and also sending signing them up for Liberty Magazine. Your church can sponsor that. It's cheap, and Liberty Magazine will mail it to your local judge or representative, whoever that is. So I think those are a couple ways that are great to get involved. Also, just being aware of things that are happening in city council and not being afraid to go and speak and to talk to your representative. Well, thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. And I'll stick around if anybody else wants to come up and ask me questions, but don't want to hold you all hostage here.
No, you've done fabulous. Everyone was blessed here this afternoon. Thank you so much, Jonathan. We really appreciate you being here, your wife, your children. You've informed us, kept us up to date with some current happenings, which is excellent. We appreciate that a lot. Wondering if we could probably close with a word of prayer and pray for you and your ministry as well. For those who may not be aware, Jonathan is also director for, I don't know if is it director? Adventist Christian Ministries? American Christian Ministries. Used to be American Cassette Ministries, and of course the middle word was changed for obvious reasons, not using cassette anymore. And if you're not familiar with American Christian Ministries, tap in, go to their website, excellent sermons, resources there to get in touch with there. So thank you for your ministry and your work. Why don't we stand together and we'll pray together. Oh, and thank you too, shouldn't forget Robert. Thank you, Robert, a religious liberty leader, preparing for this day, getting Jonathan here. Thank you so much. Much appreciated. Valuable. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we're so grateful that Jonathan could be with us here today, his wife and precious children. We're grateful for what he's shared and the information he's passed along. We're grateful that what he's shared is sound and biblical and also rooted in the spirit of prophecy. And we're grateful for the warnings, the cautions, in alerting us to some of the current issues and how we ought to be praying and talking perhaps with our representative via pen or voice, sharing concerns related to religious liberty issues. We pray, Lord, that we will always value the freedoms that we enjoy and take full advantage of them as we have been commissioned with sharing the three angels' messages. And so, Lord, continue to bless us to this end, guide us and pour out your Holy Spirit upon us that we might experience genuine and true revival and reformation. Bless Jonathan and his ministry and his family. Keep them in their coming and going too, and continue to use them in a special way to uplift these very important messages among your church and church members here in these United States and elsewhere, potentially as he travels. We thank you again for blessing us here today. Keep us as we part from this place. May we not part from your presence, for we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Dishes on the way out, if they're in the kitchen.